You're listening to Heal Through Humor, hosted by yours truly, Talia Bombola. I'm a licensed therapist on a mission to help others learn about themselves and laugh along the way. Hi everyone, welcome to another episode of Heal Through Humor. Today I have with me Dr. Katie Fracalanza. I'm going to add her in now and we're going to go live all about people pleasing. Is how to have less of it in your life if it's a problem. Hello, I was just giving an intro.
Hey, Talia.
How are you?
I'm well, thanks. How are you?
Good, I'm doing well as well. I'm excited for this. I've been looking forward to it.
Likewise. So excited to meet you.
You too. Would you like to introduce yourself a little bit more to me and everybody listening?
Sure. So my name is Dr. Katie Fracalanza. I'm a clinical psychologist. One of my jobs right now is I'm a clinical assistant professor at Stanford University. So my main role is really to train other providers. So training people in CBT for struggles like people pleasing, anxiety, depression. I also run a private clinic where I train like-minded providers there. So I love to train other people and broadly just educate to tell people what we can do to break free from anxiety and people pleasing.
Yes. So how do you, and thank you for all the work that you do. I love teaching as well. And I find, I don't know if you find this, being in that role, there's like such a passion about it because having that knowledge that you want to share with another person that could potentially change their life. It's like, this is the coolest thing ever to be able to share that with them.
Totally.
Yeah. How do you conceptually define people pleasing, even if it's not in the clinical terms that we can go into also?
Yeah. And I like that you bring up like that it's not necessarily in clinical terms, like it can be related to different struggles that might be a diagnosis. But I guess I think about people pleasing on a continuum with, some folks have really low levels of people pleasing where they don't struggle to, worry about what other people think of them. And then other folks have really high levels of people pleasing. So it, feels really more daunting to the idea of disappointing somebody or not making somebody happy. So I think of it as like this spectrum, and really, it's interesting. I'd love to unpack this more with you, but I've noticed at its core is like fear of judgment or fear that we won't be accepted. So I think it's one strategy to be accepted is make everybody happy and make sure everybody is, taken care of and do for everybody else, and then I'll be accepted.
I find in a lot of the clients that I work with and people I've talked to about it, it often stems from childhood or it started around childhood, even if it was in small settings or small doses. And then somewhere along the way, because I do more psychoanalytic work, somewhere along the way, there was this, ooh, wait, I'm a good person because I'm doing this. And I think it does stem from childhood, or at least we practice it or experience it first then, and then it gets reinforced. Obviously, it can develop as we get older as well. Where do you think it comes from? What gets people started in it?
Yeah. I think there's so many different ways that it can start, but I certainly agree that learning is such a huge part of it. And I think our early learning experiences, like if we learn that we need to make others happy to be loved or accepted, or even if we started doing that and then we didn't know what would happen if we didn't make everybody else happy, like if we never get control data, so to speak, and we're just reinforced for being the good girl or the good boy and doing everything that everybody wants, it may kind of just become our survival strategy.
Yes.
I guess, so I think early learning is certainly huge. And I've noticed for people too, like if there's certain stressors, and it might happen when they're a teenager or, school age or something, but like instances where you don't feel like you quite belong. So you have to like try harder to fit in. So like going to a new school and maybe feeling different, or like you're trying to join the crew late, or even like going into a really hierarchical environment like medical school or graduate school where like you have to like try really hard. There's so many people to make happy, and then that's really reinforced in that environment. So I've also noticed where people have like a big event in their life where they feel like they need to make people happy, or they really do need to make people happy, and then we see it kind of get worse from there.
Yeah, and I think part of it also stems from kind of learning, especially from childhood, if it did stem from then, I didn't know how to meet my own needs, or I wasn't allowed to have my own needs, and my role or my duty or purpose in the family, or to be seen as good and maybe avoid punishment on that end of the spectrum, was to meet the needs of other people. So I think it can adapt over time as well. And if that is a role, or we pick a specific career in which our job is to meet the needs of other people or provide that like helping role for others, I think it can further reinforce that pattern. And oh, this actually feels good, because I think it's almost like an inverted, or like a kind of twisted altruism, because we do things for
Mhm.
other people because generally it does feel good for us. But at its core, not in not using judgmental language, but at its core, people pleasing can be seen as a manipulation, because I'm trying to move this around so you see me in this way. So it's not a judgment of using the word manipulation. It's just like I'm acting upon this to try and get this result definition of that word.
Yeah.
Yeah, I see it as that too. And I think a lot of my clients don't realize that they have this tendency until we start to unpack it a little bit. And they're like, wait, not everybody's like that. And I'm like, no. Some people are okay with disappointing others. They're like, wait, how do I get to that? And we had somebody ask that question, not that question directly, but they were mentioning in the Q&A, when I don't people please, or when I try and put myself first or get my own needs met, I feel like I'm being mean. Is
Hmm.
that normal? Is that typical? I think it is. If we're used to being so nice and never having needs, literally doing anything assertive would probably feel very uncomfortable at least,
Totally.
and feel mean. What do you think about that?
Yeah, oh, there's so many juicy things you
Yeah.
said that I want to weigh in on.
Yeah.
But on that point, yeah, I think at first it feels so scary. Like, I think that judgment, I'm being mean, comes up a lot. And I
Yeah.
think it's all relative to what we're used to entirely.
So true.
Kind of a little example, not related to people pleasing directly, but I'm Canadian. And I noticed when I first moved here, like 7 years ago, like everybody would talk to me and like people
Yeah.
coming up to me and I'm like, oh my gosh, like what's happening? And I'm more introverted, so I didn't necessarily want that. And then I was
Mhm.
getting feedback from my friends like, oh, you're like smiling all the time, or you're acting really friendly. And so, of course, part of that is my journey of overcoming people pleasing, but part of it was just like cultural norms. So in Canada, right, it's normal to be smiling or making
Approachable.
small talk more often. Yeah. And of course, I moved to California and it's a little different here. So I think that idea of just like getting used to a new way of being in the world can be really scary and it feels really off. So I think having anxiety and self judgment after, before, during, all of that stuff is part of the process.
You bring up such a good point about culture also, because
Right.
at least as far as I've studied it and learned it, culture is a group of any two people with common traits or more, and that could be racial, it could be ethnic, it could be geographic. There's this grouping of people, and so each state, each county, each country, we all have our own sense, and each family has its own culture too. So you double, like kind of that double effect of, if I grew up in a culture at large where everybody was very nice and approachable and kind, it's not people pleasing because that's kind of the way you operate. But then it's in your family, or if you're not used to that, and then your family is the one it's like, oh no, everything's fine, right? The high pitched tone, let's just not have conflict, let's not have any issues. Then we can grow up feeling like that's our norm, because that's the culture that we grew up in, either on like on a geographic scale, or like that nuclear family scale, whatever early childhood interactions we had. That's like such a good point to bring up, that if we grew up in an area where that's the norm, then you go
Right.
somewhere
Yeah.
like, wait, not everybody's like this.
Totally. Yeah. And I like how you're bringing in families too. And it's interesting because I guess I would say like, this is such a generalization, but like, yeah, politeness and being like friendly, warm, like it is more people pleasing type socialization where I grew up.
Yeah.
Um, and yeah, more expected. And then in our families too, if you see your folks, like your parents acting a certain way, it might feel really
Yeah.
mean, or you might get feedback that like, oh, we don't act that way, or that's rude, or that's mean. So
Yeah. It's reinforced in either direction. And it brings me back to, I don't know what year of grad school it was, but we were talking about how different places in at least westernized culture, different areas of the world, or the United States compared to the world. It's like the Midwest is like very nice, very this, but also very passive aggressive, because they'll be very like, oh, bless your heart, like very patronizing when they're trying to be nice but mean at the same time. And then you
right.
coast, which is typically like more associated with like outward aggression, very assertive, like tough New York vibes, or, you know, I think it changes as you go down the East Coast, and then West Coast is a mix. There's some transplants, there's some people who are like super chill, nice surfer. Like we have all of these stereotypes, I think, across America, but that Midwest vibe. I remember somebody in
Yeah.
school, like, oh no, we're very mean, but we'll just do it nicely and be like, oh, bless your heart. And you won't know they're insulting you. And I'm like, dang, that's so true though, when you think about how like the language around it and like the linguistics and the lexicon change as
Yeah.
well. Like I notice, I don't know if you notice this with your clients or people that you teach, typically the people pleasing is almost connected to more passive aggressive language or more conflict avoidant language. So that also supports, if we use any sort of assertive language, it will feel comparatively mean to being passive aggressive or to being conflict avoidant. How do you see your clients use words and what type of communication styles do you think they have?
Yeah. Well, I don't know if this answers directly, but it just a light bulb went off in my mind as you were talking. I made a post earlier this week, and it was about how people pleasing is actually related to anger.
Yeah.
Because it's actually been my most popular post. So I didn't know that I guess we don't talk about this much, right? Like this idea that we think about people pleaser, we tend to think of more internalizing traits, because on the surface it really is, you know, we're more afraid of judgment. We might be more sad. We're not getting as many of our needs met. It's more like the marginalized character. But on the inside, right, if we're not getting our needs met and we haven't learned to speak up and say what we want, like that doesn't just go away, right? Like that's there, and it's building on the inside of how unfair and like unbalanced relationships really start to look if we're chronically people pleasing. Like we're listening to somebody else, we're caretaking for somebody else, we're doing everything for somebody else, and so their needs are here and our needs are here. And that anger is really felt intensely on the inside. So resentment builds. And then a pattern that I've noticed that I described in this post was the stuff it, stuff it, stuff it, stuff it, stuff it, explode. So this idea that like we try so hard to like avoid conflict and like we try so hard to meet the other person's needs, and we're trying not to get mad. But if we do that enough, basically the fear ends up happening. The fear, the conflict, or ending the relationship because we're not getting anything out of it. It's just like giving. It's like, screw this, I'm not going out with this person anymore.
Right.
So it's, I guess, a paradox where if we can't, or we haven't learned to express something directly, then it comes out. It's coming out some way or another. It's coming out indirectly, or it's coming out, you know, when we're, you know, talking to our friends about our partner, it's coming out, but it's not coming out in a way that really serves us and strengthens the relationship.
Yeah, it comes out sideways and everybody
else. Exactly. Or explosive, like beach ball gets pushed down and then all of a sudden,
and how could you? And this was just like the time that this, and you're just like, oh, that's a lot. I thought we were having a conversation about this. And being the recipient, another question we received was, being in a relationship with somebody who is a people pleaser and being last on their list, and kind of how to handle that. And I have kind of my own thoughts on that, on like why that pattern happens. Again, that's like the analytic part where I'm like, well, why were you even interested in each other in the first place to get to that point? But now that we're here, right, they're married, from what the person wrote in. How would you recommend, maybe, or any sort of kind of skill to utilize if we are noticing, oh, my partner or a friend even has this pattern, however, I don't seem to be the beneficiary of this, I'm not receiving the people pleasing, I kind of feel like I'm last on the list. What do you make of that?
Yeah, and I think it's funny because I don't know if a lot of folks are aware of that.
Yeah.
So I know I've heard, you know, people I work with talk about that, right? Like my partner just like said yes to doing this for our friend, and they didn't think about how that would impact me. And really this idea of, you know, if saying yes is driven by anxiety, then yeah, we might see it outside of our closest circles, right? Like again, usually in a partnership, we might be in the closest circle. So our partner is not afraid to say no to us, right? We're not the recipient of the anxious yes. So and I guess my approach with that has been to share like where that basically assertiveness of then where that impacts the partner of the person people pleasing.
Yeah.
Like for
Yes.
example, oh, when you said yes to do that thing for our friend, it leaves me holding the bag with childcare. Like,
Yes.
oh, like that really, that really hurt. Like, can we renegotiate that? Can we
Mhm.
figure that out? So
Yeah.
like really back to then the person asserting their need and how that impacted.
Yeah, and you had a post on it recently, and I talk about this a lot as well. The explaining what the impact is rather than the, which is instinctually hardwired typically in women to do that, which is being like critical or judgmental as a way to change. Because back in the day in evolutionary psychology and like herd mentality, we did not want to be in the out group. We did not want to be outcast or ostracized because back then it meant you died. Like if you weren't
Sure.
included or you weren't given provisions, you were no longer in the herd. We've evolved though since then, but that instinct and that drive is still there. So instead of complaining about why it's negative or why it's hurtful, it's sharing, this hurts, leaving it at that. Instead, I would like to be consulted before we make decisions that may impact both of us. It's shifting it to the positive so your partner who's hearing that can go, oh, okay, I actually am motivated to do what you're asking because I'm not going to be motivated to stop if you're just complaining at me that I'm the worst person in the world for doing this, but not giving me an out to be
Yeah.
seen as a person again. So it's, I know the urge is there, and I've had that too. We're all human. Like wanting to be angry, that's internally dealt with, ideally with a therapist too. And then you deliver it to the partner. Hey, that didn't land well with me. Here's why. Could we do this in the future? The fear though that conflict is going to end the relationship or end the friendship, I think that's what prevents a lot of people from being assertive, is that limiting belief. If I speak up, it will be the end.
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah, so
And a
that's
lot
very,
of
very good feedback.
totally. Reminds me, what you're saying reminds me just of my life as a mom. So I have a toddler, and
Oh boy.
there's a lot of behaviors that
Yeah.
have a negative impact. And this idea of like give the alternative behavior. So like I don't want you to hit the glass, but you can hit the floor. Or I guess it reminds me of what you're saying with when we're asking for what we need from our partner, right? It's not like less don't do this and more can you do this?
Yeah.
Here's
How,
what I need.
tell me what I can do that won't
Yeah,
hit.
the alternative behavior.
Exactly. Yeah. Let's hit this instead. Exactly. Not with
Yeah.
your partner. No. Just,
Yeah.
if you're angry, please redirect it not at me. Right. Yeah. And I think being able to talk about, as somebody else had mentioned, the positive, the potentially positive sides of maybe not full on clinically significant, this is causing me negative problem people pleasing, but like the surface level,
Mm.
putting first, being nice and being altruistic. I think there are positive benefits of that when it's used, sporadically, or when it's used intentionally. Oh, I think I would like to help this person in this way, not I'm going to help them so they become reliant on me. So now I have a purpose in their life and they won't leave. Like the more positive light sides of kind of that technique of people pleasing. Can you think of any of them? Again, not to like a clinically significant level, but if
Yep.
something is more kind or agreeable as a personality trait, what do you think some of the positives are?
Yeah. And I think this goes back to too. It's funny when we're talking like, oh, I have all these ideas and I share one, and then we move to something else like, oh, there's this other idea. In terms of like the origins of people pleasing, I know you and I were talking about early learning. I think another origin is being rejection sensitive or interpersonally sensitive. So I think we're all born differently when it comes to interpersonal sensitivity, just like height. Like some people
Mhm.
are super feelers and they really feel their own and other people's emotions intensely. And then some people are just low feelers where they, feel less and feel others' experiences less. And there's, I think, a lot of gifts all along that
Yeah.
continuum. But I think a lot of people pleasers are highly sensitive or interpersonally sensitive. And I think that when one is not like people pleasing to a detrimental extent, it can be such a gift because you
Mm-hmm.
can feel what others feel, which gives opportunity for deep, deep connection, deep love, deep intimacy. You can, even feeling your own emotions really intensely, like love and joy and interest and passion. So I think it's almost like it's this superpower gone awry when we're bleeding out trying to do everything for everybody else. But if we can kind of cut that back to where we can manage,
Yeah.
then we can use that sensitivity to care for others, to help others while like caring for ourselves, to um, yeah, to like feel what is to be felt in the world, right? The awe of a sunset, or
Right.
bringing our gifts to the world with passion. So that's one of my favorite things about helping people overcome people pleasing, is like, once you stop the bleeding, then it's like this beautiful trait. And I find that a lot of people pleasers really are wonderful helpers. So, and
Yes.
again, not in a pathological way. I'm not helping because I'm anxious, you won't like me if I don't, or
Right.
I'm not helping because I'm scared to not be needed. It's like, I'm helping because I love doing this.
Yeah, the altruistic part. And teach my students this too when we go back and forth on social psychology, that there's at least a couple of schools of thought on if absolute altruism exists, because even if
Mm-hmm.
goodness of our own heart, we feel good in return. So we do get
Like,
something, even if it's not like a tangible thing. So I have some students who are like, yeah, I'm more in that camp. And others are like, no, I feel like that's not what it counts as. I'm like, and the good news is we're all right.
doesn't
Like,
matter. Yeah.
right. And it doesn't matter if it feels good for you, and it doesn't create in almost invisible checks and balances behind the scenes. I've noticed that a lot as well with people trying to shift out of the more pathological, or really like it's internally chaotic to be that level of people pleasing, to the more I'd like to be of service when it fits my own needs and boundaries. Like that shift, it's that invisible checks and balances has to go away. But if I'm busy caring for others, then I get to avoid what's going on inside of me, and I don't have to feel my feelings if I'm busy doing everything else for everybody else. So it's half I have to stop avoiding my emotions, and half I have to start being assertive and grappling with, ooh, I don't like feeling mean and I don't like feeling my own feelings at the same time can feel like a lot.
Totally.
Yeah.
Yeah, that emotion exposure, or there's many different things we can call it, but I think that is one of the hugest skills that we have to learn, and that journey out of people pleasing is tolerance for our emotions, and like weightlifting that muscle of tolerating the anxiety that somebody might be disappointed, and even the anxiety about what happens. A lot of people pleasers at the beginning don't know how people would react if you said no or you asked for something. So it's like just tolerating the straight uncertainty of it. But I think, yeah, we can really grow that capacity. So I think
Definitely.
that's a huge, 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 huge piece. And my background is in exposure therapy. So originally, and I don't know why I wanted to tell you this today. I was thinking about like, what do I want to share? And
Yeah.
yeah, like, so one of the first experiences I had as a therapist was watching people overcome phobias. So
Mm-hmm.
things like snakes. So I remember I
Yep.
took somebody to the reptile store, terrified of snakes, so much so that it was like hard for them to leave their house.
Mm-hmm.
And they started to like pick up, these are non-poisonous snakes, but like that learning that can happen when we approach something that we feared. So by the end of our time in the reptile store, she had like snake in her hair, snake around her neck. And so this idea that we can have, yeah, new learning. So I think that's huge, no matter what the fear is for people pleasing, like the fear of being rejected or not accepted, that we really can, with repeated approach, probably not just one visit to the reptile store, but many,
Yeah.
many, many repeated
Yeah.
attempts at saying no across a really long time, but we can practice that.
Mm-hmm. And I teach my clients that when kindly, and I teach the difference between nice and kind. Nice is telling people what they want to hear at almost
Mm.
any cost, to include keeping an intact image. Kind is telling people in a polite way, even if it hurts, that's not the intent, what is the actual truth, not only what somebody wants to hear. So the goal is striving for kindness, and in saying no to the other person kindly, you can say yes to yourself kindly. But until they start to see it that way, it only feels like a no, which increases that threat of like, but they're
Mm.
going to reject. It's like, okay, so even if they do feel slightly disappointed, that is a typical response if somebody asks for something and they've expected it, that you are going to say yes. Because if you're breaking out of people pleasing, you might notice people are coming to you because they know you'll say yes. And when you start setting those boundaries, it can feel uncomfortable. And they're like, wait a second, but you always say yes. And you can't say no because I've already done my day according to you saying yes, like you've always said. So this isn't going to work for me. And you can also share, well, I'm working on saying yes to myself more. And part of that means I can't say yes to everybody else. So without even saying no, we can help, I think, clients understand it's okay. It's okay to let other people be disappointed in you. And it can feel like the end of the world. It doesn't mean it is the end of the world.
Yep. That's such a good point. Yeah, and this idea that other people can be disappointed, but it usually doesn't last that long or end the
Yeah.
relationship. Like it's not a
Right.
catastrophic event, but I think until we practice with that, it's hard to really know that in our body.
Mm-hmm.
That
Yes.
like what's the arc of disappointment? How long does it go on for? What does it feel like? You know?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I think if your parent or primary caregiver, whoever you interacted with early on, how did they express disappointment? What is your template for disappointment is something I work with my clients on. How long did it last? Was it really uncomfortable? Was there something negative associated with the disappointment? Or was it modeled that we can express it, we can understand it, and it can be moved on from? Not quickly in a rushed way, but like it doesn't endure for a long time where you're sitting there like, do they like me? Do they not? That's not a comfortable experience. So I really like to dive in and understand like, okay, when did this start for you? Was it
Yeah.
2 weeks ago? Was it 20 years ago? How much are we really coming up against, and how many beliefs are we going to be rewiring, having you become more assertive and feel comfortable sharing more of yourself with the world rather than meeting only the needs of others?
Yeah.
Yeah. We had a question. Let me go back.
Yeah, and I've got some questions too.
Sure. I have a theory. I'm wondering if you agree. What is the difference between people pleaser and caregiver? My theory is that a people pleaser has self-assigned themselves the role of caregiver without the other person asking for it, and the behaviors can look similar. And being a caregiver, or kind of a providing care for another person, there may be more of an explicit agreement, like a parent-child dynamic, a employer-employee relationship. It depends on what like the provision is, what's the care that's being given. There's usually, I think, gut reaction, more of an explicit agreement or role that's assigned where we consent to being a caregiver or a caretaker. And then with people pleasing, it's like we elected ourselves, I'm going to be the best and meet the needs of everybody else with or without them having to ask.
Yep. Yeah, I think I think about it similarly. The key thing that flew up in my mind as you're talking is this idea of choice. And something I hear a lot from folks is like feeling like it's not a choice to not people please, like feeling like that's not an off button or it's not an option. And usually the thing in brackets there is like, because I'm too scared, right? Like I can't say that in brackets because I'm too scared, or I'm not sure how to tolerate that anxiety yet of saying no to my boss, or saying no to somebody else. So I think people pleasing feels automatized, or like there's not an option, because it's like I don't feel safe if I don't do that. I don't feel like I'll have my supports or my job or things that I depend on that I need so much if I act more authentically. Whereas a caregiving feels like, and I guess there may not be a choice or not feel like a choice in some cases, but I think of that role as more of a choice. I like how you're saying like consent to it. It might be a job, it might be something we agree to do as a parent, or to someone elderly in our family or something like that. But and this idea that caregiving has a fixed role to it, where like I might be a caregiver when I'm with my son, but I'm not a caregiver when I'm then out at the park with friends or something. When people pleaser, it feels, at least when you're in it, like you can't take it off.
Yeah, that's how you might show up, or how a person might show up with most everyone in their life, or kind of regardless of the role. That's how they're showing up. It's more like intrinsically motivated, and then it sounds like that role can be shifted, or like a superhero cape, we can take it off when we're done giving care to other people, and then put on to care for ourselves.
Yeah. And I think ultimately what you and I are talking today is that's where we want to be moving with people pleasing others, is
Yes.
like when we have capacity and we have bandwidth to do that, and it feels like it's coming from not an anxiety place, but from like whole heart place. People pleasing cape can go on, or maybe we
Mhm.
wouldn't call it that, but like, doing things for other people can come
Yeah,
on, but the idea that it's not on all the time.
I agree. That's a really good way to put it. You mentioned that you have some questions and content. I would love to.
Yeah, well, this idea of what's the difference between people pleasing and something else. There's a couple of things that people asked about, and I would love your take too, because I know
Sure.
you and I have slightly different training models as well.
Yeah.
Difference between codependency and people pleasing.
Ah, yes.
And I have some thoughts, but I'm sure that people would love to hear both of our thoughts.
Yes. It's, I think fortuitous that this got brought up because I'm actually working on, we're like co-authoring, a few other people and I are co-authoring a book, and that's one of the chapters that I'm writing on. So I have a lot of data to share. I will try and summarize.
Fantastic. We came to the right place.
I think codependency, if we're looking at it like in a clinical sense, there's typically multiple roles assigned. Again, it's like that caregiver where there's an agreement to it. And in codependency, it's I am reliant and dependent upon another person and how I can fulfill their life and pour in their cup or meet their needs separately from people pleasing. And that enables them to do something that may or may not be good for them. So that could be codependency in drug addiction, that could be codependency in workaholism, any sort of thing that's done to like a holicism level. I think codependency stems more from this systemic pattern that can happen. Obviously, people pleasing can be systemically modeled in families as well, or culturally, like we talked about. But I view codependency more as it's enabling potentially, and it doesn't mean that it's enabling a positive behavior. And typically, multiple people in the system are suffering. And then there's the one identified patient who ends up usually in treatment, and that's who we're working with. And then we see, oh, wait, there's more to the story than this. I delineate that from people pleasing, that people pleasing doesn't only enable people to do things that are not good for them. It typically enables a system to be reliant on that person. And the people pleaser feels a sense of worth and a sense of protection from rejection or disappointment. So the intent, I think, of the behavior is different, at least in the research that I've done. I'm curious how you would, that's just like the surface
Similar
level.
thoughts. Yep,
Okay.
similar thoughts. My bullet points are codependency. There's two people, at least two people involved.
Yeah.
The caretaker, usually the one with
Yeah.
people pleasing-ish traits, and then the like sick person.
Mm-hmm.
And the idea that there, the main reinforcer is
Yeah.
that there's something that feels really good about caretaking, or that
Right.
is like reinforcing, I don't know who I'd be if I wasn't the caretaker. They wouldn't,
Mm-hmm.
they'd abandon me if I wasn't the caretaker. So that
Right.
kind of fear. And then with people pleasing, I guess I see it as quite anxiety driven. Like, forget how you put it, but
Mm-hmm.
in my mind, it's like I won't be accepted if I don't do what
Right.
other people want. So,
Right.
and I don't know how to be with that anxiety yet. So I'm going to do what everybody wants.
Yeah, the anxiety piece is definitely, I think it can be felt by both. It's differentiated. I think anxiety is what provokes the people pleasing, and then potentially protection against depression, failure, more of like the negative self-worth thoughts. That's what provokes potentially the codependency or guilt. I think a lot of guilt can underlie when we're codependent. That fuels the cycle, especially when I would work with families who are in treatment, when the parent would be, well, that's all they needed me for. And so, of course, I'm going to give them money. And I know it's bad and wrong, but I still want to feel needed in some way. And I feel guilty because I wasn't there for them when they were growing up. And like, there's so much other data, I think, depending obviously on the nuanced situation, that it's typically more of the like guilt, depression, et cetera, that we're trying to protect ourselves against. Than people pleasing is that anxiety, disappointment, rejection, more, will they like me? I don't know if I'll be accepted.
The social anxiety kind of feeling.
Yeah. Yes, I agree.
Yeah. Yeah, I was reading about this the other day, and it's also this interesting like thing, like that most people who are codependent are people pleasers, right? Because they're pleasing the person that they're caring for, but not all people pleasers are codependent.
Yes, I saw the Venn diagram while you were talking about it.
Yeah,
So
so it's like people pleasing isn't even, it's broader, and codependency is like a certain kind of people pleasing where there's like a system, caretaker
yes.
and sick person.
Yeah, there's multiple roles attached. And then we had somebody ask just now, and then I know you have more. Would you say people pleasing is a form of anxious attachment? I'm probably avoidant and feel like I don't say yes enough to people. I think people pleasing can come with it, can be presented when you have anxious attachment. I don't necessarily think it's a form of it. I think it might be a symptom or like a something that's prevalent when we do have anxious attachment. And if we don't say yes enough, that doesn't necessarily mean it's pathological. That's one of the problems I think with Instagram is like, well, if I do this and other people who do, it's not everything's a pathology. You might just have great boundaries and you don't need to say yes to more people. Like, I've never met you, but that could very well be it too. It doesn't have to be pathological.
Yeah. But that makes sense to me. I think, yeah, certainly one manifestation of anxious attachment might be people pleasing. It might play out in other ways. And I think it's possible too that people pleasers could have a healthy attachment and have like that really sensitive temperament, or have had experiences of bullying or been in a highly critical environment and then became people pleasers. So I don't think every people pleaser has an anxious attachment.
Yeah, it's kind of like how we were talking about the not every codependent.
Right.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's same thing, very similar. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
What else do you have?
Okay. Along this line of what's the difference between people pleasing and other stuff, got asked the question, what's the difference between people pleasing and covert narcissism?
Okay, that's a good one. That's a really good one. So, narcissism and codependency, I will say, if we're looking at like the human magnet syndrome, they're on opposite ends of the same scale of self-esteem struggles. So, not a lot of people talk about this piece because I don't think it's as catchy on social media, honestly. But narcissism is a form of coping with low self esteem. So, from an analytic perspective, and in self psychology, we all have narcissistic traits. All of us do. It's how well they're integrated or not, and to what degree is it a healthy expression of ego or an unhealthy expression of ego. But if you look at that scale, a +5 on this end is extreme overt narcissism, and covert falls under that. For the sake of just narcissism is on this side trying to cope with low self-esteem. I don't feel good enough, so I need people to think I'm amazing. And on the other side of it is codependency, which is a -5, which is I don't think I'm great, so I'll just derive my self-worth by being of service to other people, and I love being needed. A +5 and a -5, and the numbers go to 0, they typically partner together. They're kind of very attracted in an inverse way to one another because they both know the struggle of having low self-esteem and deeply fearing being seen for who they truly are, but the external way they're coping with it looks different. It either manifests as codependency or it manifests as narcissism. So I would say covert narcissism at its core is different from codependency in the sense that the empathy that I think codependent tendencies can access is starkly different than the empathy that covert narcissists can access if we're talking about like true clinical diagnosis.
At high levels
yeah.
that most people don't have. Yeah.
No, and because there's not there's a disconnect, and if we look back on it, it's from like 0 to 2 or 0 to 5 typically is when this gets enforced, personality disorder wise, at least in analysis, that there's this cutoff of it's not necessary or it's not safe for me to see people as people. It's more of a struggle to see people as people rather than to see them as objects or things of use. This could be modeled. I could go into a whole other episode on that. I don't need empathy as much because I can manipulate people in other ways, right? And so like in the beginning, the people pleasing is a form of manipulation. Ideally, both people get something out of it, but in narcissistic relationships, it's more parasitic rather than in people pleasing or maybe codependency to some degree. It's more symbiotic where we're both getting something out of it, even if it's not great. That's more of it if we look at it from like the biology terms.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So interesting. Yeah, when I first saw that question, again, I wasn't thinking of it from that angle, but a similar answer came to mind that like the classic narcissism struggle seems to be the opposite of the people pleasing struggle on the face of it.
Yes.
Right? On the face of it, with narcissism, we see more entitlement, and again, with
Mm.
overt narcissism, like my needs are more important than yours.
Yeah.
And with the typical people pleasing struggle, it's like my needs are less important than yours.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, both different ways of coping with not feeling so great on the inside.
And the cup that gets filled, or like the switch that gets turned on by both, is why that's so powerful and why that's so magnetically attractive. So being more immune to, how did I word it yesterday? Being more immune to being attracted to and attractive to either very narcissistic traded all the way to diagnosed, or very codependent traded pathological, meaning like causing internal stress, people pleasing, is to work your own self to a nice homeostasis of, I have assertiveness, I have boundaries, I can care for other people, including myself. I'm at the top of my own list. It's not as enamoring or attractive, again, to be around somebody who needs you a lot, or who is very egotistical potentially, or you feel something's off and you're like, there's some string attached to this. I don't really know if I want to be around that person, or I can tell being around them is more to boost their ego than to be a friend or any other reason we would spend time with someone. Yeah. So that's a really good, I'm going to add that actually. So I'm going to add that part to the
fantastic. So thank you to the asker of that.
Yes, thank you.
A couple other questions, but I want to make sure we touch on like what to do about it. I got a lot of questions with that flavor, like, what do we do about it? And I think one thing that comes up for me immediately when I get asked that is like, crap, like there's no easy magic bullet for this struggle. Like there's no thing that like we can say in one sentence and then you'd be like, oh, sweet, I've got it.
Yeah.
I know what to do. I know what to do. You know, that these are, I think of overcoming people pleasing as really a process, and to, you know, if it was easy, we wouldn't be talking about it and people wouldn't be struggling with it. And it's, you know, you would know the answer, that it really is, takes chipping away at. Just like if you wanted to get really, really fit, you would have to do exercises repeatedly and daily and keep on building, keep on chipping away. So I think that's an important piece to know, because I don't want people to think they're like failing if this is a process. You're not missing something. It's like a hard, effortful thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's almost, how would I word it? You have to unbecome the self that you know in order to become the self that you've been trying to hide. Maybe. I think that's how I word it, and that should feel uncomfortable. And I don't often use the word should, but in order to speak to the person who's feeling anxious and maybe like, I'm failing at this, that process on the surface, that should feel uncomfortable. That's congruent, right? That's like that behavior matches the situation. You don't know who you are, and deep down you know who you are, and you're trying to swap those roles. Discomfort is the emotion that fits the facts, to use DBT language. So I owning that emotion rather than trying to shove down the discomfort or internalize shame the discomfort. Well, I shouldn't feel uncomfortable. No, you can. You're absolutely allowed to feel uncomfortable. This is not a fun process. And here are some skills that can help you. And here's how to have aftercare once you've set a boundary, and not double back and not go, but just kidding. If not, it's totally fine. I'll do it. Mute yourself. Write it out. Right. Throw it away. Do not tell the other person.
No texting back for 24 hours. Yes.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And learning to love and oneself also. If I'm okay with something I say a lot is, what you own about yourself another person can't use against you. So if you go in and face all the dark, shadowy parts of yourself that you're trying to avoid, then if somebody else happens to meet them, right, you've brought them out into the light. We're all IFS, we're all parts are welcome. We're good, we're integrated. It won't matter as much to me if you don't like me or you reject me. And this is where kind of the analytic lens looks at it. If I'm deeply afraid of being rejected and I'm the one rejecting myself the most, it's going to hurt even more when somebody's rejecting me. If I'm already disappointed in myself, I've internalized some voice along the way, and another person expresses that, the reason why it's so tension building is because you feel like you're about to be found out. Somebody tried to shine a light on the shadow and you don't want it because you haven't integrated it, and then you get triggered and activated. We don't usually get triggered by things that we either don't do ourselves or to ourselves. So the less you do it to yourself, the more you love and tolerate and like yourself, the more able you are to accept that from other people. That's my theory on that.
Yeah. I think about that just like a different lens, but from a self-compassion lens, this idea that like,
Yeah.
It's the same idea, but just like different angle. If we are not a safe place within ourselves, if we're criticizing ourselves and we're not, okay with ourselves, we're just mean to ourselves, that we're really anxious when we're with ourselves and we look to the outside, to other people's approval, to other people's validation to kind of return to baseline and feel okay. But if we can learn to validate ourselves and soothe ourselves, and ourself becomes a safe place, like having a best friend by your side, like it's okay here, then even if, there's chaos going on the outside or somebody else doesn't like you, you can withstand that rejection because you have self-compassion.
Yeah. And that self-compassion also takes a while to develop when we are used to being criticized or critical of ourselves, and nobody's there to modulate or regulate our super ego, and we develop a really intensely critical super ego. It's going to feel like an attack on yourself when you use self-compassion. There's the dark part of you that doesn't want you to love or be loved, and that's at war sometimes a small battle, but sometimes fully at war with this lighter part that wants to be compassionate and accepted. And again, it's that internal integration makes it easier to tolerate when other people are nice to you and compassionate with you rather than lashing out. And I think it's that dark part often that lashes out, because it's like, whoa, no, you can't be compassionate or nice to me. That's not what we do here. We're mean and critical. That's what we get done. Please don't be nice. So I go pretty deep with a lot of my clients on like the parts of them that they've identified in their self and what's the purpose of it and how can we retire it rather than shame it out, because shame usually comes up uncomfortably like heartburn. Yeah,
Totally.
Yeah.
It's really interesting. A lot of people I've heard describe this intense fear of self-compassion because it'll make me complacent. Then I won't be like, a good person if I'm not telling myself my mistakes, or I won't work as hard. I won't achieve my goals. And it's so fascinating because the research on self-compassion actually suggests that people persist longer. People get up after they fall down. They accomplish things like quitting smoking quicker or making other behavioral changes in their lives quicker when they're a friend to themselves. So it's interesting how much fear we can have when we don't know what it's like to be kind to ourselves.
Yes. And are we betraying some sort of maybe unspoken family lineage or credo or motto if we go against the grain, right? So if I want to be accepted by myself or by society, will that mean by my family or my culture of origin standards, I won't fit in with them? Because if I talk to myself that way, will I receive shame from them? So it's like, how much can I tolerate to leave potentially this group or what's ingrained belief wise in me in order to have autonomy and individuate and be out in society? And that can be uncomfortable as well, especially depending on the age and like the season of life somebody's in when they're learning these behaviors as well. Yeah. I have more questions. Ask me anything. I like this.
So I think I just want to summarize. So I think the two things that you and I are talking about, like two prongs to recovery, are like self-compassion is certainly one, and exposure to the fear, like slowly approaching the feared thing, slowly being more and more assertive. This one's specific. I think it's interesting. I'm curious what your go-to is here. I have some ideas. How do you pause before saying yes? Somebody said it's really hard to, what they've already said yes, and then they're already regretting it. It's already out of their mouth. The horse is out of the gate. How do we start to pause before we agree to do stuff?
I teach this a lot to the teens that I've worked with and families. To stop the impulse, you have to count to 3. So
a little distress tolerance.
No trick needed other than just being able to count to 3 in whatever language you speak internally, And then you can also say, let me get back to you. So that's not a yes and it's not a no. It's like that nice middle ground where you can learn to have the distress tolerance and say, you know, you can say any high accolades sounds great. If I'm able to, I would love to. What a great offer. Thank you so much. Anything that feels like the people pleasing. So it can kind of hit that urge of like, I was nice or I was kind. And
Yeah.
make the agreement that you would have to go back on. It
Yeah.
builds that bridge of I can still be nice. I can be seen as positive. And bonus, I'm not seen as now somebody who overcommits and backs out or who says no abruptly. The antidote of saying yes all the time is not immediately going to saying no all the time. It's counting to 3, take a breath and share unless your gut tells you, yes, you can do this, kind of get in better with your intuition. Let the person know, I will get back to you. Let me text you in an hour. Let me think about it. It's okay to buy yourself some time.
Yeah. Necessary, in fact. Highly recommended.
Yes, we
Yeah.
recommend. Yeah.
Yeah. That's
Yeah.
one thing that, so yeah, I love all of those ideas. I think like developing a go-to and rehearsing it again and again and again, like,
Yeah.
let me check my calendar and let you know, or let me get back to you on that, where it's just like what you say. I think that can
Yeah.
become the new auto response. The other thing I've done with people is like making a rule with yourself. Just like you
Yeah.
will not agree to anything until you've thought about it for 24 hours.
Yes.
I think one of the things at the beginning is even not knowing what you want to do. Like you may, when someone asks, you may think you want to do it because it would make them happy or
Right.
like,
Right.
so it actually takes some time, I think, for us to notice if it fits, if we want to do it, if we can do it. So 24-hour rule is another one I've used.
Definitely. Yeah. Buy yourself some time. Just sit on it. It's just like a big contract or any big life event when I do business coaching, because I have a lot of clients who'll get offers all the time. And I'm like, okay, slow it down. First of all, you don't have space on your calendar. Second of all, even if you did, why are you saying yes? And buying yourself time, that's a cool off period. That's also built into a lot of contracts. Hey, if you sign this, just know in 24 to 72 hours, you're allowed to say no and we'll cancel it immediately, because sometimes emotions get in the way of us when we're making a decision. So I recommend taking space as well, so you can be in wise mind. You can be walking that middle path, as DBT calls it, where you have your emotion brain and your thought brain balanced and honored, and you're making a true decision that honors both you and the other person and isn't repeating any compulsory patterns that you're used to that you're also working to get out of.
Completely.
Cool. Do you have any last minute questions? We have time for, I think, a couple more.
The one last one that I have is it bad? Is people pleasing a bad thing? Is it harmful to myself? I have lots of thoughts.
I do too.
Yeah.
My gut is that the person who may have asked this is a people pleaser. So one answer I have, if that is the case, I don't know, is that highlights that internalized narrative of potentially shame or guilt. I don't want to be seen as bad or wrong. Is something I'm doing bad or wrong? So whether, side note after that, whether or not you are a people pleaser, if you've asked that question, or if you asked yourself that question, I think there's multiple definitions of bad. Is it bad in the moral sense, going against societal standards, etc.? No. Is it bad in the individual moral sense? Like, what are your core values? That's subjective, up to the person, and it doesn't make you a bad person, right? If this is a misaligned action with a value, I would recommend describing it as that rather than is it bad? Does this align with my values? Yes or no? Rather than I do this thing, does it make me a good or bad person? Because I don't want to be a bad person, because if I'm bad, I won't be accepted and I'll be rejected and other people will be disappointed in me. So please tell me that it's not a bad thing to do, right? I would shift and use more empowering language, not about moral value, good, bad. Does this fit for me or not? Does this help my life or not? And on an overall, like we talked about, in some senses, yes. In the non-pathological sense, people pleasing can be helpful, altruism can be helpful. If it's negatively impacting your life, then I wouldn't recommend continuing it, and I would recommend trying to heal your way out of it. What do you think?
Yeah, I similarly agree that I don't see it as like black or white, all or nothing. I think this behavior is on a continuum. Sometimes we really need it. I wouldn't have gotten through grad school without people pleasing. I think a lot of
Yep.
people are in the same boat. Like you wouldn't be where you are. You wouldn't have survived certain situations without it. But yeah, I tend to think about it in terms of usefulness. Is it helpful, not helpful?
Mhm.
And I think we kind of, you start to get that internal gut feeling when it's hurting you. Like when you want to
Yes.
do something, but anxiety is choking you out and you're not able to say it. Like, you know, you start to like hear that knock on the door from your intuition. Like,
Yeah.
I don't want this. I want out of this
No.
relationship. Yeah,
Yeah.
I want a different job. I want like, so I think it's like when we hear our internal self saying something different than what our shell is doing, that's when we know we need to start to break out.
So good. So good to bring that up. Definitely trusting the intuition.
Yeah,
You're
it
and
tells us.
oh yeah, it will
It'll
scream,
tell you.
it will scream at us sometimes.
Yeah,
And
you
then
can
finally
push it
listen.
down and push it down, but it'll let you know you don't
No,
like what
yeah,
X or Y that you're doing.
I can't have my own needs. Silly inner voice. No,
Yeah,
no. This has been so dynamic. I
it's
loved
been
being
so
able to
fun, Talia.
super fun. And I think the viewers hopefully got a lot out of this. And if you're looking for more resources, you can check out either of our pages. If you're watching the replay on this, there's multiple posts on Katie's page. There's multiple posts on my page that can help you with shifting away from people pleasing if it's causing you any sort of problems and learning to be more confident and assertive. So I think we're a pretty good blend when it comes to that.
Absolutely. Got lots of different angles, lots of different sides of the elephant.
Yes. Do you have any courses or classes that people can keep an eye
I
out for?
do. Yes,
Hey,
I will be launching a Stop People Pleasing class on the 23rd. Really
awesome.
comprehensive program, step by step, all the different skills to break free. And so the link to sign up to that is in my bio. And I'm
Perfect.
gonna, yeah.
Good.
So
Um, I I have a insight masterclass. So for those of you who are watching this and like, how do I ask myself those questions and getting to the why and like the deep down part, that link is also in my bio for the insight masterclass. And it's a very in-depth, I think it's over like 5 to 7 years worth of research all put in one very nicely organized course that's self-led. And if you need questions answered, you can contact me after. So you have all the resources you will probably need to be the best person you can be and to not be having problems being caused from people pleasing anymore. So I want to say thank you so much for your time today. You are a wealth of knowledge, and I would love to have you on again if you're open to that.
that would be fantastic.
Cool. Well, thank you,
I'm gonna make a
everyone.
joke about not committing to
Oh,
things right away to model that for people.
that would be
No, but
that would be fantastic. That's
this
not a
this has been really wonderful. I know I said to you, like, I tend to get really tired. We might need to wrap up after 30 minutes. And I just checked the clock and we've been talking for an hour.
You're
So
like, okay, good.
yeah.
Awesome. Well, thank you again, and I hope you
Thanks,
have a
Talia.
good day.
You too.
Bye.